Thank you for that introduction, Kendall, and welcome back, everybody, to another week of our series, Follow, where we are looking at the life of Jesus as we go through chapter by chapter the book of Mark. So I want to start with a little story about myself. I grew up in Massachusetts, and when I was 6 or 7 years old, my parents bought a new house on a full acre of land. But up north, we live in Florida, in case you're watching online, which I guess you are because this is the video. But in Florida, grass is delivered to houses on pallets. But up there where we lived, we had to grow grass from seed. And so we spent a lot of time crawling around the yard, picking up rocks out of the soil. Now, I am pretty sure that I was not the most helpful person in this. After all, I was just 6 years old. And an acre doesn't sound like much, but when you're crawling around trying to get every last rock so that there would be room for the grass to take root and grow, it becomes pretty much a labor of love. And so the reason I bring that up is I just want to make a connection. Last week we talked about the parable of the sower, and it's also sometimes called the parable of the soils. The names we give it are not part of the inspiration of the Bible. This is just how we remember it. And I just want to real quick go back through a run through of just 4 key points. Jesus talks about 4 different soils that the seed of the word gets thrown upon. And the first one he mentions is the footpath, which is hard-packed soil. And this represents somebody that has a hard heart. So someone that the word is not going to penetrate, has no ability to take root. In fact, just as an aside, what Jesus said is the enemy comes and takes that word away so that it will not be effective at all. The second type of soil that Jesus mentions is the rocky soil. And when Jesus explained this parable, what he said is that leads to a shallow root. And so what happens is in times of hardship or suffering or perseverance, the seed does not get nourished and it withers away. So the word in that case is not a source of sustenance. And so that likens back to the story I shared about cleaning up all the rocks off the ground. The third types of soil that Jesus mentions is the weedy soil, which leads to a crowded root. And so what happens there is because of other desires of life and busyness and loss of focus, the word gets crowded out by other concerns. And last but not least, what Jesus mentions and what I think and I hope we all strive to see ourselves as is the fertile soil. And the fertile soil produces fruit abundantly. It has ample ability for the seed to take root and to flourish and to produce fruit. So we notice as we go through this parable, just in a quick review, that 3 of the 4 soils have some level of efficacy to them. Some sort of growth either has happened or has the potential of happening. And so is that the end of the story about good dirt? And so I wouldn't even bring it up if it was. So the answer is no, that is not the end of the story. As we continue through Mark chapter 4, Jesus is going to expand on the good soil, the fertile, the good dirt, and we're going to look at it in a little more detail. So today we're going to read through Mark chapter 4, verses 21 through 41 in different increments. So if you have a Bible or if you're going to read the Bible on your phone, or it'll be at the bottom of the screen as you're watching along with this video. And so I'm going to start reading with verse 21, and I'm going to read up through verse 23. As always, this is the New Living Translation, so if your words look a little different than mine, you might be looking at a different translation. So it starts off by saying, then, so this is just after he finishes telling them what the parable of the soils or the parable of the sower, what it means. Then Jesus asked them, would anyone light a lamp and then put it under a basket or under a bed? Well, just as an aside, lamps back then were an open flame, and their bed was probably made of straw, so I am hoping that everybody that Jesus was talking to would say no, but that's just an aside. Sorry, I jest and not very well. So of course not, Jesus says. He answers the question for them. A lamp is placed on a stand where its light will shine. That's the purpose of a lamp, he says. For everything that is hidden will eventually be brought into the open, and every secret will be brought to light. Anyone with ears to hear should listen and understand. So this paragraph is the first of 3 parables that Jesus is going to use to teach in a row. And this one, as we saw, is about a lamp. And Jesus opens with that silly rhetorical question because he's trying to make a point about purpose and efficacy. The fact that a lamp, if it is going to do what it's supposed to do, it has to be out in the open to shine. One interesting thing about this in our New Living Translation, because of what a lamp is and the type of object it is, the people who translated the New Living Translation said, would anyone light a lamp? If you're reading the New International Version or the English Standard Version or King James Version, it probably says something like, would anyone bring a lamp? But different than all of that is the literal Greek phrasing of this, which doesn't necessarily make sense for a lamp, but it makes sense when you're understanding the parable and what Jesus is driving at. And what it literally says is, does a lamp come? Well, we know lamps don't move of their own volition. That's the reason that it gets translated differently. But Jesus here is making an equality. And he is saying that the lamp is coming on the scene just as he is coming on the scene with this message of the kingdom and repentance and forgiveness of sins. And so what this parable is all about and how we start today's lesson is that Jesus and his kingdom will not remain hidden. Now, in some of our past weeks, you may have noticed, and I've had this question asked of me several times, Jesus has asked unclean spirits to not say anything about him. He's asked people that he's healed to not say anything about him. So there's this kind of motif of secrecy going on, and Jesus is answering that here and saying, right now it's appropriate that things remain under wraps. But that is not how things are always going to stay. My contention is that Jesus doesn't want people at this moment speaking about who he is because they don't understand what kind of Messiah he is and what his role is and what this kingdom is going to look like. So he does not want false expectations propagated throughout the whole country. Jesus wants to remain in charge of that. But with this parable, Jesus is giving his disciples assurance that it's not going to be like that for long. That what his kingdom is all about and who he is as Messiah is going to be plastered for the whole world to see. There's going to be a time for them as disciples, and as they begin to spread the seed of the message, that everything is going to be clear and apparent about this kingdom. And that's what Mark's entire gospel is setting up for. Everything with a laser focus is aimed toward the very end when we see what kind of Messiah Jesus is and what kind of kingdom he has come to establish and what our response to that is going to be. So don't forget, we, the audience, the people Mark is written to, we have been privy from the very opening verse that Jesus is the Messiah. He is the Son of God. We know that. We are kind of like an omniscient observer to what's going on in this story of Jesus. But the disciples, all the people around Jesus, all the people in the crowds in the countryside, they have not necessarily been clued into the full truth of that. So we know, as the audience, that we have to filter everything about Jesus through the resurrection. But that hasn't happened yet. So everybody here is still trying to figure that out. So Jesus is plowing the soil to prepare his disciples. He wants them to be that good soil, that the seed can take root and flourish. Notice in what Jesus says here, But if you go back through chapter 4, if you read through chapter 4 this week, which would be a great thing to do, you notice that Jesus says to listen and to hear. He says that 13 times in this chapter alone. He is putting a high priority on paying attention. He wants his audience to be very aware of the words that he is speaking. And back in biblical thought, okay, we lived in that context, the word listen just doesn't refer to hearing the sounds. Listening means that not only are you hearing the words, but you are obeying what they say. There is a response implied when Jesus is saying hear or listen. We're going to continue through Mark chapter 4. I'm going to read the next two verses, 24 and 25. After he finishes that parable, then he added, pay close attention to what you hear. There's the word hear again. The closer you listen, the more understanding you will be given, and you'll receive even more. Those who listen to my teaching, more understanding will be given. But for those who are not listening, even what little understanding they have will be taken away from them. Hearing and obedience, they are related and intertwined concepts. And so we see in this paragraph that we just read, the teaching of the parable of the sower is being echoed. Jesus is telling his disciples, the more you lean into what he is teaching, the more you listen, the more you let it go into you and you internalize what's going on, the more fertile the soil of your heart is going to be. So when you encounter those problems and persecutions and worries that Jesus likened to rocks in the soil, or when you are tempted by the allure of wealth or the desire for other stuff and other circumstances like the weedy soil that Jesus mentioned before, we will not allow those things to divert our attention from Jesus when we lean into him, when we are ever close. So remember, just as Jesus is speaking these things to his disciples, the 12 and those around in the bigger group of disciples, he's speaking these things to us. So the thing that I want us all to remember as we go through this message and we go through our week is that exposure to Jesus' words transforms the soil. Exposure to the words of Jesus transforms the heart that we have in us. How does soil become hard? By not listening, by not doing, by turning away. And notice as we go through Mark, who are the ones that are not listening? Who are the ones with the hard hearts? Those are the teachers of the law. They hear Jesus' words, they're not listening. Their response is to plot ways to take Jesus down. How does soil become good dirt? Well, by listening and responding. And notice who's doing that? Well, so far, fishermen and tax collectors and Peter's mother-in-law, we saw a few weeks ago, they hear and they leave everything to follow this man who has asked them to be his disciples. Now we go to the next parable in Mark chapter 4. This is verses 26 through 29. Jesus also said, "The kingdom of God is like a farmer who scatters seed on the ground. Night and day, while he's asleep or awake, the seed sprouts and grows, but he does not understand how it happens. The earth produces the crops on its own. First a leaf blade pushes through, then the heads of wheat are formed, and finally the grain ripens." So there's a process to this growth. "And as soon as the grain is ready, the farmer comes and harvests it with a sickle, for the harvest time has come." Now this parable that we've just read through, this is unique to Mark's gospel. This is a parable expanding on the idea of the good soil. This is exactly what happens when the seed lands on good dirt. And we're told that the earth produces crops on its own. The seed lands and it doesn't appear like anything is happening. It just looks like the seed and the soil know what to do when they come together. The words there in Greek say that the earth produces crops without visible cause. And so since there is an invisible cause to this, this part of the parable is an allusion to God's presence in the equation of growth. It's handy for us to remember that we don't grow by just trying real hard and scrunching up our face, and I'm going to grow and I'm going to be the best disciple possible. We don't grow by our own effort. Growth is the result of divine activity in our life. Now, does this mean that our response is to sit back and be passive and drink a Coke and wait for God to produce this growth in me? Not at all. No, that would be the exact wrong thing to do. In fact, go back up a few verses and read the previous parable that we just talked to. What we're supposed to do is pay close attention. We're supposed to listen. We're supposed to be invested in the words of Jesus. That is how we prepare our heart so God can make the growth happen. There's a commingling between the power of the seed and the quality of the soil. You grow because that's what seeds do in good dirt. Paul makes this same point when he is teaching the Corinthian church. There was some dispute in the Corinthian church. Some were following Apollos and some were following Paul. And Paul says, no, you're missing the entire point of what's going on. And he says it's not important who does the planting or who does the watering. Both of those things are, by the way, very important. Okay, it is important for us as disciples to spread seed. It is important for us as disciples to make sure that we're watering and making sure that the seed gets nurtured. But what's important, Paul says, is that God makes the seed grow. We're not to take pride in how much effort we're putting in, because it's not our effort that makes us grow. Growth spiritually is God's domain. And so herein lies the importance of creating a rock-free or weed-free heart within us. Just building on last week's imagery. The less impediment there is, the deeper the root can be. The more growth is going to happen. And all of this is leading somewhere in the parable. Notice, the seed gets scattered. We don't hear about the farmer again until the very end. At the end, when we see that there's a harvest. The farmer comes and he puts the sickle to the whole crop. So it's good for us to remember, since we're sitting here 2,000 years later, we might not be familiar with this imagery. The harvest is the image of final judgment. And so while this is not a parable about judgment, this is a reminder that God is in charge and He is directing the whole course of our lives and the lives of other people that are citizens of the kingdom. Another reminder of this happens in Revelation chapter 14, verse 15. Just wanted to show you the harvest imagery again. And this is... John writes here, "Then another angel came from the temple and shouted to the one sitting on the cloud, 'Swing the sickle, for the time of harvest has come. The crop on earth is ripe.'" Harvest and the end judgment go hand in hand. So all of us whose hearts are open and attentive to Jesus and the message about his kingdom, we are those that are going to be harvested. The kingdom that we live in with Jesus, this is a kingdom without borders. And it's a kingdom where our only allegiance is to Jesus alone. And so these parables taken together, they give us a frame of reference on how we can look at ourselves. If you're not producing the fruit of love in your life for others, if you are not increasing in your persistence and perseverance, if your surrender and obedience to God's will is lacking, it is indicating that there is something wrong with the soil of your heart. And that's a tough question for us to wrestle with. But if we want to achieve that growth, or if we want to allow God to achieve that growth in us, we have to make sure that our hearts are focused on things above. Continuing in Mark chapter 4, this is verses 30 through 34, Jesus said, "How can I describe the kingdom of God? What story should I use to illustrate it?" It's like he's got a whole Rolodex of stories going on here, and he's trying to pick the right one. "It is like a mustard seed planted in the ground. It is the smallest of all seeds, but it becomes the largest of all garden plants. It grows long branches, and birds can make nests in its shade." Jesus used many similar stories and illustrations to teach the people as much as they could understand. It was like he was cramming in everything that he possibly could into their brains. In fact, in his public ministry, he never taught without using parables. But afterward, when he was alone with his disciples, he explained everything to them. So Jesus mentions a mustard seed, and on the screen you'll see a picture of the size of a mustard seed in relation to someone's finger. Now you might be thinking, ha, I know Jesus is wrong here because the mustard seed's not actually the smallest seed there is. That belongs to a different plant. And so we have this question, was Jesus wrong? In fact, when I Googled this earlier this week about the size of a mustard seed, many of the top results were advocating that this is one of the reasons why we should not believe Jesus, that he was wrong about the seed. But here's the thing. The seed being the smallest one or not being the smallest one is not the point of the parable. And Jesus is also talking into the awareness of the crowd 2,000 years ago who might not have an extensive view of botany. What Jesus is doing is he's making a contrast here. He's not giving trivia about the world that he created. The contrast is between beginnings and results of the kingdom. The mustard seed, being so very small, shows us that the beginning of the kingdom is seemingly insignificant, probably even unnoticed by the standards of the world. Right? We live in a world that judges everything by the size. Bigger is definitely better when we are looking around. But here's the thing, and this is what Jesus is pointing out. Even though the mustard seed is so small, it fits on the tip of your finger, it leads to great and surprising results. Here's a picture of a mustard shrub. This particular variety is an Ethiopian variety. I don't know the difference. I am not a botanist. I just looked for a pretty image of a mustard plant. But what we do know is that a mustard shrub can grow from 6 to 15 feet tall. But all in all, this is a very atypical choice for Jesus to pick to picture the vibrancy and the strength of this kingdom. Typically in the Bible, kingdoms are denoted by strong and unmovable trees. If you look up in Daniel chapter 4, a tall tree rising to the heavens represents the Babylonian kingdom. If you skip forward to Ezekiel chapter 31, a giant cedar is the picture of the Assyrian kingdom. And in fact, if you flip back then to Ezekiel 17, that same cedar is used as the image for the Messianic kingdom. But instead of a giant tree growing tall and proud and strong, Jesus chose a garden shrub instead. So from this seed, though, we get a distinct picture of the elements of the kingdom that Jesus has come to employ. So the kingdom of Jesus defies all expectations. Whereas many are looking for a big military power for this new kingdom, Jesus is saying that it's going to come and it's going to exist in a much humbler form. Hope in Jesus is much different than our usual vision of what greatness is in human terms. Jesus makes this point himself in John chapter 18 when he's talking about his kingdom. He answers the people he's talking to, "My kingdom is not an earthly kingdom. If it were, my followers would fight to keep me from being handed over to the Jewish leaders, but my kingdom is not of this world." His kingdom does not share the values and the measure of success of this world. His kingdom is a completely different style. So from humble beginnings will come glorious power. But there are a couple other ways that this kingdom defies expectations when we look at the mustard shrub. First, Jesus said that there's going to be birds taking nest and living in the shade. This is representing that people from all nations, Gentiles, are going to come and they're going to find their home in this new kingdom. This would have shook the Israelite audience, that they would not be the only beneficiaries to the messianic kingdom. There's another expectation that Jesus is crossing off the list. Another thing is that the mustard plant is invasive. When it is left to itself, it will create new seeds every 30 to 60 days, and it will take over a pasture of land. That is a perfect image for the kingdom of God. That it happens maybe slower than we think it should, maybe it happens less visibly than we would like, but the kingdom of God is taking over. Here's the end of Mark chapter 4 that we're going to go through today. This is verses 35 to 41. And instead of a parable, we go into a different situation. As evening came, so that phrase right there links together this story with what Jesus has just taught in these parables. So as evening came, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let's cross to the other side of the lake." So they took Jesus in the boat and started out, leaving the crowds behind, although other boats followed. But soon a fierce storm came up. High waves were breaking into the boat, and it began to fill with water. Jesus was sleeping at the back of the boat with his head on a cushion. The disciples woke him up, shouting, "Teacher, don't you care that we're going to drown?" When Jesus woke up, he rebuked the wind and said to the waves, "Silence, be still." Suddenly the wind stopped and there was a great calm. Then he asked, "Why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith?" The disciples were absolutely terrified. "Who is this man?" they asked each other. "Even the wind and the waves obey him." So again, in Mark, we get this picture of Jesus on the move. He's constantly in motion, going from one thing to the next. And this is an amazing miracle story, and there is lots to be said about this, but I only have a couple things I'm going to mention here that are relevant to our idea of the good dirt. But if you want a fuller teaching on this, I have something that I did at the Crossing as well as another church a couple years ago. I have the audio. I'd be happy to send it to you, and you can hear all the good stuff that is packed into this miracle story of Jesus. Just send an email to scott@thecrossingchurch.org, and I will send you the audio file, and you can play it while you're driving to work. So just a couple things to point out. Rough waters are symbolic of the powers of evil and chaos, and also the tribulations of just people. So we've got Jesus, we've got his disciples in this boat, they're treading on these rough waters, and in the middle of all of this chaos that's going on, Jesus is sleeping soundly. This is the picture of complete trust in the one who sent him. But we see by contrast, the disciples have a decidedly different reaction to what's going on. They're screaming and they're yelling and they're fearing for their lives, and they finally wake up Jesus, and Jesus gets up, and instead of comforting them, he looks out, he rebukes the wind and the waves, and everything becomes calm. And what Mark is doing here is he is setting up the response of the disciples to Jesus' power. Remember, Jesus has promised that all things are being revealed to them. Well, he's just revealed his power to them in a very significant way. The ability to control the weather and the environment and the water, that is something attributed throughout the Old Testament to God alone. Jesus has just sent a message about his identity to his disciples. But he doesn't say anything about that. He turns to them and he rebukes them as well. And at that point, you've got 12 guys who are completely terrified. The Greek there says they feared great fear. It's not just enough to say they were afraid one time. They feared great fear. So this shows us that there are two fundamental responses to Jesus, either fear or faith. And we see the fear in the disciples at this point, and Jesus is asking them, where is their faith? Where is the good soil of their heart that the seed is taking root in? They are chided by Jesus for their lack of faith, even though they are getting the privilege of being taught and having everything revealed to them personally. See, fear comes from a lack of faith. But the good news is that faith repels fear. The reason I included this paragraph, this miracle story, after the parables about the good soil and the parable of the mustard seed is this passage reveals the inadequate faith of the disciples. And it's revealed when they say, "Don't you care?" It's not enough that they just said, "Oh, hey, Jesus, there's a lot of waves. What's going on here?" They made an accusation at Jesus. "Don't you care that we are about to die?" And that demonstrates to all of us, because we know where these guys are going to end up. We know the end of the story. It shows us that developing faith, developing the good dirt of our heart is a journey. And this is really a point of evaluation for us. What areas of your life reveal your inadequate faith? When you're going through it, when you're at the end of your day looking back, or when you're thinking about what's coming up, what do you say to Jesus? "Don't you care that we are about to what? Don't you care that I'm about to lose my job? Don't you care that my kids are sick? Don't you care that I might get COVID?" And we launch these accusations, and they come from a heart of fear. They come from a heart that is choked out by weeds, or is filled with rocks, or maybe even a heart that is getting harder and harder toward the things of God. So what comes to mind? What weeds or rocks in your heart do you need to give some attention to? We shouldn't just listen to messages and not have a reaction to them. This is how we are supposed to respond. We're to prepare our heart so God can do a great thing through us. So faith, this idea that Jesus expresses at the end of this miracle story, faith is the human expression of good dirt. Having a faithful heart is having a soft heart that allows room for God to come in and move everything else out. So how do you need to respond today? How has your faith grown stale, or how are you growing? How would you like to grow? Beatrice is going to come on the screen next, and she's going to help us shape our prayers as a response to what God might be teaching us and what our next steps to respond as we are hearers and listeners to the words of Jesus. Thanks for being here today.